This morning we're up to 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8 and 9 in our verse-by-verse study through the book of 1 Peter. This happens to be our fourth study looking at the topic that's presented to us in this passage of Scripture that we're looking at here today. Now, of course, the subject matter that Peter is presenting to us, it has to do with us being mindful of what's taking place in the spiritual realm around us. And more specifically, it's an instruction that Peter gives to us to be mindful of the schemes of Satan. And so this is what we've sought to do. We've sought to do this over the last 3 weeks leading up to this point. We have sought to better understand and better know our enemy so that we can be in a better place to be able to identify and combat his schemes when they come against us. Now, what have we covered up until this point? Well, we have taken a look at the reality of Satan, the origin of Satan, the character of Satan, the power of Satan, the schemes of Satan, the assistance of Satan, the providential use of Satan, and also finally the destiny of Satan. But following this topical approach to the subject of, or should I say the person of Satan, with this broader understanding now in mind, we now return to our passage itself, 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, to try to better understand, well, what is Peter actually saying here? I mean, we've looked to see what the whole counsel of God, and we've tried to do a broader sweep of what does the whole counsel of God say about this adversary, this spiritual adversary, the spiritual enemy, and we've done that leading up to this point. But now we're wanting to say, well, what does Peter actually have to say about it in this part of his letter? Well, by way of an outline of today's study, we're going to be splitting the passage here into two parts, which, I mean, how many parts can you actually break it into? It's only 2 verses. But anyway, we're breaking it into 2 parts as we consider Peter's exhortation on this specific subject of the spiritual battle, or spiritual warfare, we might like to call it. So, what is the outline? Well, first of all, in verse 8, we are going to see that his exhortation has to do with preparing our mind for the spiritual battle. So that's number 1, preparing our mind for the spiritual battle. Then number 2, second part of the outline, verse 9, is engaging our mind in the spiritual battle. So preparing our mind and then engaging our mind. Now, the majority of our study here today is going to be focused on the second point, engaging our mind in the spiritual battle. In fact, the second part, we're going to have to then spill over into next week as well. So this is going to be part 5 to this series of studies. The second part, engaging our mind, will be talked about finishing off at the end of next week as well. But for now, what are we going to do? We're going to give our attention to verse 8. Verse 8, where first of all we see an exhortation from Peter to prepare our minds for the spiritual battle. So, notice in your Bibles there, carefully verse 8, notice how Peter puts it. He says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Now, up until this point, leading up to this verse, we have seen that Peter has given us a number of different short exhortations, a number of different short words of encouragement. In verses 1 to 5, chapter 5, we've seen that he's exhorted elders of the church to shepherd the flock of God. Then in verses 5 to 7, we've seen that Peter has exhorted believers just in general, and he has done so to tell them to pursue a submissive, humble attitude. Whereas here in verses 8 and 9, we see another short exhortation from the Apostle Peter, and what is he encouraging us in? Well, he's encouraging us to be mindful of the forces of darkness which are currently at play in the world today, within the spiritual realm. And when we consider the historical context of 1 Peter, well, I suppose we can kind of understand why it is that Peter felt to give this word of encouragement in the first place. After all, we as believers, we should know that we understand who Peter was actually writing to. We understand the original audience. We know that the people that he was originally writing to were beginning to experience hardship and persecution because of their faith, and that was about to get a lot worse. Now, I think that many of us if not all of us, know by way of personal experience that when things are full on, when life is very, very busy, when there's a lot of practical stuff around us, well, we know how easy it can be to lose focus on what's actually taking place in the spiritual realm around us. And we can understand why. After all, we live in a world that is material in nature. The material world is the world in which we live in, which we can see, which we can hear, which we can smell, which we can touch. I mean, this is the world in which we live in. It's physical, and we interact with it in a very physical kind of way. And so it doesn't take too much for us as believers to engage in the physical world, does it? It doesn't take a lot of effort on our part, not a lot of intentionality, simply because we are confronted with the physical world each and every waking hour of the day. But on the other hand, although the spiritual world is just as real as the physical world, it's just as real, well, it does require more intentionality on our part when it comes to being mindful of what's going on. The physical world, don't really need to worry about it. Just open our eyes and there it is. It's all around us. We interact with the physical world all the time. But we have to be far more intentional in engaging and thinking about the spiritual world around us. I mean, we know the saying, out of sight, out of mind. And this can easily become the case for us as believers, especially when we've got a lot going on in the physical realm. When there's a lot happening in the physical realm and around us, the material world around us, and there's a way of just us neglecting or not being mindful of what's taking place in the spiritual world. Now, we know this was the case for the original audience of Peter. We know that they had a lot going on in the physical realm. They were being persecuted. That was beginning to increase. And that looked probably in all different shapes and sizes. And so we see here that Peter, perhaps knowing that what's taking place in the physical realm may cloud their thinking of what's happening in the spiritual realm, what does he do? Well, he issues this word of exhortation. He issues this word of encouragement, which is why we see here in verse 8 that Peter wants to specifically direct his encouragement or his exhortation to the thinking or to the minds of these believers. He wants to reawaken our thinking as believers to what's taking place in the unseen world. And we can see this in the way that Peter begins there. If you notice in your Bibles in verse 8, he says, be sober, be vigilant. Now notice both parts of this initial instruction here, both of these parts of the instruction, they're directed towards the mind of believers. Peter's instruction is directed towards the location of the battleground where Satan is actually waging his war, which is the mind. If you are here in part 2 of this series, you may remember that we talked about the human mind being the location of the spiritual battleground. And we referenced 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. It's where the Apostle Paul says, but I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Which is what? It's a reminder to us that the human mind is the battleground. It is the battleground where Satan seeks to wage his war, employ his schemes. It's in our mind. In other words, the thought life of the believer is where Satan seeks to wage his war. And so the bottom line is that Satan knows that if he can corrupt our minds, well then he can corrupt our lives. Satan knows that if he can get us to think contrary to the Word of God, well then this will cause us to live contrary to the will of God. Which is just another reminder to us that we can't, as believers, we cannot just blindly and naively accept every single thought that just pops into our minds. We can't just say, well, it's in there, it's in my mind, and so it must be the way to go. We can't do that. But instead, we need to become very, very good at filtering our thoughts. We need to become very, very good at assessing our thoughts to ensure that we are not being led astray by the efforts and by the schemes of our enemy. And it's with this in mind, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that we see Peter's very first instruction, beginning of verse 8 there, it's directed towards our minds as believers. Notice firstly in verse 8 that Peter gives the instruction to what? To be sober. Now, when Peter says be sober, what is he saying? He's not saying, hey, pull back from hitting the bottle on Saturday nights. He's not saying, withdraw in terms of your alcohol consumption. Nor is he saying, hey, don't become intoxicated. Drunkenness is bad. That is not what he's saying. But instead he's speaking more broadly concerning one's mental state. It refers to, we might want to call it, spiritual sobriety. It's being clear-minded. It's having a self-controlled mental state. It's having a mental state that is free from confusion and free from driving passions. Now think about it. Think about not being sober in the physical realm. Think about physical intoxication. What happens? Well, with physical intoxication, when someone's drunk physically, the person's mind begins to think about things with a distorted view of reality. They're not thinking about things around them clearly. It's distorted. I mean, you could be at the world's most dullest, boringest party. Hang on, here we go. The most boring party of the world. But you get someone who's had a few drinks under their belt. You get someone who's drunk and they're going to think that party's the best thing in the world. It was the best party I've ever been to. Why? Because again, it's a distorted perception of reality. And in a similar way for us as believers, we need to be careful when it comes to what is occupying our minds. Yes, that's what it looks like with physical intoxication, but we need to be careful when it comes to what it is that we give our thought life to. We need to be careful that we avoid the intoxicating ideas of the world that will what? That will try to allure our thoughts away onto somewhere where they really shouldn't be. We need to make sure that we are thinking clearly. We need to make sure that we are ordering our lives correctly, balancing out life's important issues, not being distracted in our thoughts by a whole lot of other stuff. This is what it is to be sober, sober-minded. We are thinking clearly about what is going on around us. Now, as we know, we live in a day and an age where there's just so much information that is flying around, so much information that is crying out for our attention, crying out for our thought life. Social media certainly doesn't help with that. And so what does Peter do? He issues an instruction for us to be sober, to make sure that our thought lives are not being given to things that are distracting us from what is really going on in the spiritual realm. But in addition to being sober, notice that Peter also instructs us to be vigilant. Now, what does vigilant mean? Well, the Greek word means to be watchful, or literally means to stay awake. That's what he's saying. Peter tells us that it's not only important to free our thought life from things that might distort our perception of reality in the spiritual realm, but here Peter also instructs us, hey, keep your thoughts in a place of spiritual readiness. When we see that word be vigilant, it's having our thought life in a place of spiritual readiness. You see, the spiritual forces of darkness will not only attack us with their schemes head on. We don't always see it coming, in other words. But the schemes of Satan are often very subtle. A lot of times they're flying under the radar. And because this is the nature of Satan's schemes against our minds, well, what does Peter do? He calls us to be spiritually awake. He tells us, be vigilant, be watchful. Watch for those schemes that come under the radar. Watch for those schemes that might come on the side and you might not kind of see them coming. Be mindful, be watchful, be vigilant. First of all, clear your mind from distraction. But then he says, do not fall asleep. Stay awake to what is taking place in the spiritual realm. And if you needed a decent reason as to why to follow this instruction, well, Peter gives it to us in the rest of verse 8, doesn't he? What does he say? The reason is because your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. That's the reason. Why be sober? Why be sober-minded? Why be wakeful and mindful and watchful and vigilant of what's taking place in the spiritual realm? Well, because you have an enemy. There's an enemy who's out to get you. And notice the way that Peter illustrates, or the way that he pictures our enemy. Notice the way that he pictures who our spiritual enemy is. He pictures Satan as a lion who is pacing, a lion who is roaring. It portrays Satan as a predator, and that we are his game. We are the bait. We are the one who he is hunting for. And by the way, it pictures Satan as being one who is on a hunt to kill. Now, it's probably worth us asking the question, well, Peter, why this kind of picture? Why have you chosen to portray Satan in this kind of way as a lion who's roaring and he's out and we're the prey and he's trying to get us? Why would you say it in such a way, Peter? Well, I think the answer is quite simple. Peter wants us to recognize that as believers that Satan and his demons are a very real threat to us as Christians. I mean, if the devil wasn't a real threat, this exhortation in verses 8 and 9, completely unnecessary, completely redundant. You should have saved your wrist the hassle there, Peter, and don't write this last bit of the letter. I mean, if it wasn't necessary, there'd be no reason for him to write it, but that's simply not the case. Yes, God, as we talked about last week, God could have simply removed all the schemes of Satan from our lives altogether. He could have providentially done that, but instead, as we talked about last week, for reasons only known to God, God has providentially allowed for certain schemes of Satan to come our way, and therefore, we must pay very careful attention to what Peter is saying here. Be sober, be vigilant, because you have an enemy. It's for this reason it is important that we prepare our minds for the spiritual battle, which is what? It's simply being mindful of it. It's not falling asleep. It's not making sure that our thoughts are not all distracted with stuff that takes our minds away from what's taking place in the spiritual realm. But in addition to preparing our minds, notice next in verse 9 that there's also the exhortation to engage our minds in the spiritual battle also. So notice how he puts it there, verse 9. He says, resist him, in verse 9, steadfast in faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. Now, what is Peter saying? Well, he's telling us not only to be mentally aware and mentally awake of what's going on in the spiritual world, but here he's telling us to actively engage our minds in what's taking place in the spiritual world also. Not just awareness, but engagement. And we see this in the words that he uses. The New King James puts it as resist him. That's what it says there at the beginning of verse 9. What does resist him mean? It literally means to take a stand against. We are to actively engage in taking a stand against the schemes of Satan. Now, what this tells us is that the spiritual battle is not merely a spectator sport for believers. It's not a spectator sport where we have the luxury of sitting on the backbenches and watching all of Satan's schemes unfold around us, but instead what Peter is telling us here is that our minds are on the front lines of the spiritual battle, and because this is the case, an active response of our mind is required on our part. Well, I suppose we kind of hear this, and probably the next question that pops into our mind has to do with the question of how. Okay, we have to be mentally alert, we have to be mentally awake, spiritually awake, we're to resist him, we have to oppose him somehow, there's an activeness that's required on our part, the spiritual battle, but the question kind of comes down to how. Well, how are we to resist the devil? I mean, what does this actually look like in everyday sense? It's fair enough if you can sort of say, yeah, we've got to resist the devil, gang. Let's resist him. Yeah, resist him. And out we walk. But how? Well, what does that look like this afternoon for you? What does it look like tonight, tomorrow, next week? How do we resist the devil in the way in which Peter is telling us to here? Well, to answer that question, we need to jump over to another New Testament passage of Scripture, which, by the way, it has the same Greek word that is translated in 1 Peter, resist. Now, the passage happens to be Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 13, and talking about the spiritual battle that we as believers are in, this is what the Apostle Paul says. He says, therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to, look at the word there, withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Now, the word withstand there, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, the word withstand is the exact same Greek word that Peter uses in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 9, where it's translated as resist. Resist, withstand. Same word. Now, why am I pointing this out? Well, I do so to just give us assurance that we're making a correct biblical connection here. Because remember, we're trying to work out the how. We've got the what, in 1 Peter 5, 9, resist him. But the how, we look over to Ephesians 6, and we know it's a correct biblical connection. The same word is used there, and it's in the context of what? Resisting Satan, resisting the schemes of Satan. 1 Peter 5, 9 tells us the what. Ephesians 6 tells us the how. However, the place where Paul really begins talking about the spiritual battle, it's actually a few verses back. It's in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 10. So I just want us to read through this together. He says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Now, a few things to point out here concerning the spiritual battle that we are in. Notice first of all, verse 10. Notice in verse 10 whose power we are to utilize within the battle. We are not to resist the schemes of Satan or the schemes of demons in our own strength, but in whose? In God's strength. What does he say there in verse 10? Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Not our might, God's might. So it's the first thing to point out, whose power we are to utilize within the spiritual battle. But then notice secondly in verse 11 that Paul explains how we are to resist the devil's schemes against us. Notice that he says we are to put on the whole armor of God. Now what does this tell us? Obviously it tells us that God has provided a means of defense. God has provided a means of defense in order to combat the schemes of the enemy. However, notice very carefully there, verse 11, that this defense is not automatically applied to our lives. We don't automatically have the defense that's required in order to battle and in order to combat the schemes of the enemy, but instead, it's something that we must actively utilize in order to be protected by it. And we see this in Paul's words, choice of words there in verse 11, where he says that we are to put on the whole armor of God. Now that necessitates that it's not automatically applied. There is engagement or something active on our part that we must do, that we must respond in a certain way in order to engage in the spiritual battle before us. We must put on the whole armor of God. But then notice thirdly, in verse 11, what the goal should be as Satan schemes against us. Well, what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve in the spiritual battle that is before us? Well, notice what Paul does not say. Paul does not say in verse 11 that we are to fight the devil. It does not say that we are to wage war against the devil. It does not say that we are to bind the devil in Jesus' name. Nor does it say that we are to outsmart the devil or overpower the devil. But what does Paul say there? He instructs us to stand. He says, stand against the wiles, that is, the schemes of the devil. Now, what does it mean to stand? It means not to retreat back. It means not to cave in. It means not to be pushed to the left or to the right, but we hold our ground. We stand. In other words, the way that we resist the devil is not by allowing him to move us from that place of confidence and stability in Christ and his word. We stand firmly in confidence and security in Christ and his word. We will not be moved. We stand. But then notice fourthly, verse 12, that Paul reminds us of the immaterial nature of the spiritual battle. What does he say there? It's immaterial. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. But who we wrestle against? Well, he goes through and he tells us. He talks about the different hierarchy, the hierarchy of demonic forces, principalities, powers. And then finally, verse 13, Paul restates what it is that he said in verse 11, that we must, what? Take up the whole armor of God. And when we take up the whole armor of God, when we put on the whole armor of God, what does it do? Well, it allows for us to withstand. It allows for us to resist all that Satan throws our way. It enables us to stand in the spiritual battle and not to be moved. Now, I think it's fairly clear to see from Paul's words that there is a determining factor here as to what happens in the spiritual battle that's around us, right? There is a determining factor of how well we will do in the spiritual battle, and that determining factor all comes down to whether or not we utilize the spiritual armor that God has made available to us. Do we see that there? What determines of how well we do in the spiritual battle all comes down to whether or not we utilize the spiritual armor which God has made available to us. And so, what Paul does in verses 14 to 17 of Ephesians chapter 6 is that he lists 7 pieces of armor which God supplies to his children in order to enable them to resist, in order to enable them to withstand the schemes of Satan and his demons. And so for the rest of today's study and spilling off into next week as well, we're going to be looking at what has God provided. What's the means which God has provided us to be able to avoid, to be able to stand, to not be given in to the schemes and the wiles of our spiritual enemy, the devil. In today's study, we're just going to be looking at the first 2 of those pieces of spiritual armor. Next week, we'll finish off by looking at the remaining 5 pieces of spiritual armor. And as we're going to see, what does Paul do? He's going to draw upon a very common image, a very familiar picture to those who he was writing to in that day. What he's going to be doing is that he's going to be drawing upon the clothing, the protection, and the weapon of a Roman soldier who was ready for battle. And he likens these things to the spiritual armor which God makes available to us as believers today. In other words, the armor of God is a material picture which Paul uses to explain a spiritual truth. That's what the armor of God is, a material picture which Paul uses to explain spiritual truth. Now, of course, there is a tendency that we have to watch out for here. There is a tendency, we have to avoid the tendency to over-materialize the pieces of armor. Okay? We need to avoid the tendency and the temptation to over-spiritualize the armor. For instance, a person might read about the necessity of wearing the helmet of salvation to get you through the spiritual battle, and what do? They go out, they buy themselves a nice big plastic helmet, they get a nice red vivid, they write across it, salvation, they pop it on their heads, and they go, here it is, I've got my helmet, it's my helmet of salvation. Every morning I'm going to put it on, I'm going to say a little prayer while I do it, and here I am, I'm putting on my spiritual armor to get me through my day. Helmet, salvation. Now friends, that's what we call over-materializing the armor of God. Now, I say that in jest a little bit. I've taken it to its kind of extreme in one's thinking, but unfortunately this happens to the vast majority, I might say, the vast majority of Christians today as they think about the armor of God. After all, you ask the everyday Christian, hey, what do you do in the spiritual battle? What can we do to fight the spiritual battle? Well, you put on the armor of God. And then you ask them, well, what is the armor of God? What is this thing that God has given to us to equip us? And what do they say? They have some very vague, elusive type of, references back to the physical armor. Well, you've got to stick on the helmet, you get the breastplate, and put on the belt, and they go back and they start talking about physical bits of a Roman soldier's armor that has no reference to the spiritual component which Paul is seeking to represent here. Unfortunately, this happens so much among Christians today. But again, the armor of God, it's a material picture which Paul uses to explain spiritual truth. And so yes, talk about the helmet, talk about the breastplate, talk about the belt, but make sure we don't actually leave out what those things are actually representing. The physical in and of themselves is not what protects us. It's the spiritual truth that is represented by those physical things. That is what protects us and enables us to stand. It's important that we understand the message behind the illustration. Now, if you want to understand what the armor actually is, if you want to know what the armor of God is in a nutshell, it is simply this. The armor of God is simply biblical truth. Want it summarized? It's not helmets and breastplates and swords and everything like this. Simply put, the armor of God is biblical truth. And as we look at the various pieces of armor, we need to understand that they all tie back to specific truths in Scripture. What this means is that when Paul tells us to put on the armor of God, he's not, saying, get your physical helmet and put your breastplate on and now I'm ready to fight the world. No. When Paul tells us to put on the armor of God, what he means is to rightly apply specific biblical truth in our thinking, knowing that our thought life is the location of where the battle is actually taking place. Each piece of the armor represents specific biblical truth that we need to apply to our thinking so that when temptation comes into our thinking, when condemnation comes into our thinking, when doubt and fear come our way, well, we must choose who are we going to believe. Are we going to believe the thoughts of the enemy, or are we going to choose to believe the truth of God's word? When we choose to accept to believe the truth of God's word over the lies that the enemy would place into our minds, that is what we call victory. That is what we call standing against the schemes of the wiles of the enemy. It is not putting on your helmet, physical helmet. It's not putting on your physical breastplate. It's not girding up yourself with your physical belt. That's not going to do a single thing. But instead, it is choosing to replace the lies of the enemy with the truth of God's word, and when we do that, and when we buy into that, and we let that affect our lives, that is what we call standing against the wiles or the schemes of the devil. So, it's with this in mind. Let's give our attention beginning now in verse 14. Again, where it talks about the armor, it's Ephesians chapter 6, verses 14 to 18. And we're going to give our attention to the very first piece of armor, which we can call the belt of truth. It's number one. The belt of truth. Notice how Paul puts it there beginning in verse 14. He says, "Stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth." Now what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing here firstly that truth is symbolically represented as a belt. That's what it meant when it says gird yourself. What are you girding yourself with? You're girding yourself with a belt. Truth is symbolically represented here as a belt. Now, thinking on a purely physical level here for a moment, a belt for a Roman soldier was a very foundational piece of armor. Very, very foundational. You think, well, how is that armor? Well, how is that dress wear? How is that attire for a Roman soldier? Well, we have to understand that Roman soldiers, they would often wear long flowing garments. Those long flowing garments would almost go down to their knees. It wasn't a dress, but it was kind of something like that, a garment going down to one's knees. But what did the belt do? The garment goes down to the knees, but what did the belt do? Well, what the belt did is that it gathered up the soldier's garments so that he could freely move, so that he could freely fight, being unhindered by loose garments. Maybe it was all loose if you're kind of hanging out with your mates. But when you're going into battle, when you're ready to fight, you gird up your garments. You make sure they're tied up. Girding himself with a belt gave him mobility, gave him support, and so it was very, very critical part of his military attire. You did not want to leave for battle without the belt. Now, shifting from the physical, it's the belt, physical belt, now to the spiritual. Well, this really brings into question the whole matter of how we deal with the truth of God's word. If the truth of God's word is going to be effective and be an effective piece of armor for us in the battle, if it's going to be effective for us to withstand the schemes of the devil, what have we got to do with the truth? We've got to gird ourselves with it. What do you mean, gird yourselves with the truth of God's word? Well, it means allowing God's word to have a foundational, governing place within our lives. It's not just hanging somewhere out there, but instead it is brought in close. It was applied as a support. In Paul telling us to gird ourselves with truth, it tells us that in order for God's truth to be an effective piece of armor in the spiritual battle, we can't be passive about the truth of God's word. In other words, just because the truth may be available to us, it doesn't mean we'll automatically become useful to us within the battle. Now think about this. A Roman soldier may have access to a belt, but how good is that belt going to do him if he doesn't take it and use it and apply it and gird himself with that particular belt in a certain kind of way? He may have the belt, but the belt is of no good to him because he's not utilizing, he's not girding himself with it. And in a similar way, for us as believers, we need to take hold of the truth of God's word and we need to put it to use in the sense of rightly applying it to the specific areas that Satan is seeking to scheme against us. You see, there are some Christians who look at the Bible in a mere intellectual kind of way. Just looking at it intellectually. They study the Bible as they were kind of studying Shakespeare or some kind of, work of literature of some sort. Yes, they may be able to lay out somewhat of an outline. This is what the Bible teaches. These are the main doctrines of the Bible, chapter and verse. Yet, there is somewhat of a detachment between the truth which they know and how it is that they navigate through day-to-day life. And you see, their lives are simply not girded with that truth. So it is for the Christian who has an attitude of seeing God's word, seeing the truth, but living in such a way where there's a detachment. It's not brought in. It's not a support to what it is that they are doing in everyday life. And you see, our enemy wants that. Our enemy wants for there to be a detachment in the way in which we relate to God's truth in an everyday kind of way. Sure, go to church. Sure, study your Bible diligently, but just make sure that you keep the truth at arm's length in terms of how it relates to everyday life. After all, there's the churchy part of your life, and there's also the everyday, real-world part of your life, right? There's a detachment, right? Wrong. That is what Satan wants us to believe. And as we've seen previous studies, what is Satan? He is a liar. He's a schemer. He's a deceiver. He wants to try to set us in a different direction than what it is that God's will is for our lives. Now, I suppose the question that we want to be asking ourselves at this point is really quite straightforward. Is the truth of God's word what holds our life together? When there is an issue, when there is a decision to make, when there's a need for counsel in the direction in which we are going, where do we turn for counsel? Do we have an attitude of, let's go and see what the Bible has to say about that? Because if we don't, if we are not girding ourselves with the truth of God's word, or we're opening up ourselves to be influenced by the schemes of the enemy. Because think about it. If the truth of God's word is not the point of reference, we might want to call it, if it's not the point of reference through which we view our time here on earth, how easy is it going to be for our enemy to take us off track? Think about that. If the truth of God's word is not the point of reference for our time here on earth, how easy is it going to be for the enemy to get us off track in terms of God's will in our lives? When we have a decision to make, when we have that, we need to seek counsel, when there is something new that we're thinking about adding into our lives, if we are trusting our best judgment to try to make the right call, what's going to happen? Forget it. our hearts, naturally speaking, seek after things apart from God. Our hearts can't be that place of safety and security. We'll give in to temptation. But as we seek to hold our lives together with the truth of God's word, as we allow the truth of God's word to be what governs that supportive influence within our lives, then we will be protected from the schemes of the enemy. At the end of the day, our enemy cannot be withstood by human reasoning. He cannot be understood by tradition. This is what others do. It cannot be withstood by personal charisma. I can get through this with my personality or any other carnal means. The enemy cannot be overcome by carnal means. God's truth alone must shape our thinking and our living. And when we trust what God tells us instead of what Satan tells us, it's then that we have victory over Satan's plans. What are we to do with the truth of God's word? Not just to let it hang there like a flowing garment, but instead we're to utilize it. We are to gird ourselves with it. We're to apply it in such a way that makes our lives shaped by it so that we can move, we can be supported in a way that we know is reliable within the battle. And so this is the belt of truth, girding ourselves with truth. But moving on from the belt of truth, Paul mentions another piece of armor, also found in verse 14. And that is that we are to put on the breastplate of righteousness. Now, what are we seeing here? He moves from a belt to now a breastplate. Well, we see here that righteousness is symbolically represented here as a breastplate. Again, thinking it from a purely practical, physical, level for just one moment, what was a breastplate? A breastplate was a piece of metal, and it covered and protected the vital organs of the soldier. It protected the heart, it protected the lungs, it protected the liver, it protected the pancreas, and any other thing that you might want to add in there that you don't want to kind of get stabbed or poked with a sword. It protected all the vital organs of the person. Now, the ancients, they believed that this part of the body where the breastplate protected, they believed that was the seat of the emotions. So, the emotional side of who we are was all in that kind of area. Today, even, we say similarly, we refer to sorrow, when we're feeling sorrowful, we refer to it as what? I'm brokenhearted. I'm brokenhearted over this situation. Well, what are we meaning? That our physical heart is broken somehow? No. Again, we're referring to what they did back in Paul's day. They're saying that the seat of the emotions is in that area. Sometimes you hear, probably not sometimes, a little while back, you hear people talk about the bowels of mercy and in reference to compassion, for instance. What is it talking about? It's talking about that area again. It's the seat of emotions right here. Now, if that's what it is practically, let's shift now over from the physical to now the spiritual realm. And what we need to understand is that it's very important for us to understand that Satan will attack and seek to attack directly pointed at our emotions. He will seek to direct his attack towards the part where the emotional part of who we are. He will place a thought into our mind that will condemn us. He'll place a thought into our mind that will discourage us and leave us feeling as though we're just not good enough. And what happens? We become discouraged. Emotionally, we begin to crumble. And every one of us knows what this is like. But if we accept those thoughts, if we accept those thoughts of condemnation and of discouragement, what's going to happen? Are we going to be on more fire for God by accepting those discouraging thoughts that would really be targeted at our emotions? Are we to be more inclined to boldly step out in faith to serve God and serve others if we buy into those discouraging, condemning thoughts from our enemy? No. Condemnation discouragement, the feeling that we're just not good enough, that's going to put us in a place of doubt and despair. It'll cause us to shrink back. It'll cause us to withdraw into our little shells just like a little turtle. You know, turtles, they get a bit afraid. They're uncertain of their surroundings. What do? They shrink back. They go into their little shell, and that's where they stay. And as the believer buys in to those direct attacks that tells us that we're not good enough, points to our past track record, all these sorts of things to try to discourage us, discourage our emotions so much, well, this is what he wants. He wants us to shrink into that little turtle shell, and there you have Satan on the outside, patting the little turtle shell. There, little one. It's safer for you in there. You know there's a big world out here, and you know that you're just not up to what it is that the world has to offer out there, so you're just not up to it. You stay in your little shell there, Christian. There you are. Good Christian. It's safer for you in there. Pat, 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 pat. And so often what happens is that you have Christians who are paralyzed and they're ineffective in their Christian walks because they have bought into the devil's discouraging lies that he has planted into their minds. They're just paralyzed. They're ineffective. They won't come out of their shells to actually serve the Lord wholeheartedly because they've bought in to what it is that Satan has told them. He's convinced them that these things are true. And so we ask ourselves the question, what is the spiritual armor for this? What is the spiritual armor to protect us from these kinds of schemes of the devil? One word: righteousness. That's what Paul says. Put on the breastplate, protecting the seat of the emotions. Put on the breastplate of righteousness. Now, some people read about the breastplate of righteousness, and what do they think? They think it's all determined by their own righteousness. They think that their own righteousness is what will protect them against the schemes of the enemy. I mean, if I live in a certain way, if I live a holy life, this is going to protect me against the schemes of the devil. Now, friends, I don't know about you, but I don't know if my own righteousness is up for it. I really don't. I don't know if our own righteousness is up to counteract the attacks from Satan. We have to understand that our own righteousness never works for us. Our own righteousness only ever works against us when it comes to the spiritual battle. Our enemy will take one look at our track record. You try to put your righteousness up to the scheming thoughts of the enemy. You try to put that up as your defense of how well you've done, of what a holy life that you're living. Our enemy will take one look at our track record, and what will he do? Well, it'll give him fuel to condemn us and to discourage us and to prove us that we're not good enough. Our own righteousness works against us in the spiritual battle. And if we're relying on our own right doing to try to get us through, then guess what? We're finished. But thankfully, the breastplate of righteousness has nothing to do with our own right doing. How do we know that? Well, Paul doesn't say, put on the armor of Jason. He doesn't say that, does he? What does he say? He says, put on the armor of God. And so we are not to look at our own righteousness when it comes to the attacks of Satan. When the attacks of Satan come our way, we are to look to the righteousness of Jesus, which God has made available to us. When condemnation, when discouragement overwhelms our thinking, our first line of defense is to apply the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ to our situation. What do I mean, the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ? Don't be scared off with the theological term. It's a very important reality that we as believers need to understand. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 says this. It said, for he made him who knew no sin be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. On Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, Jesus said this. He said, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Perfection is the requirement in order to have a right standing before God the Father. And no doubt when Jesus was giving that Sermon on the Mount, there were probably a few dry gulps in the congregation there. Are you kidding me? Perfection? Then we read in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 to 40, Jesus summarizes the law of God into 2 commands. Love God and love other people. Now we ourselves know when we are completely honest with ourselves, we have to admit that we have never achieved this level of perfection on our own, nor could we. We have all fallen short. None of us have done right. None of us deserve to have a right standing before God. But this is where Jesus comes into the picture. Jesus' mission wasn't simply just to die on the cross for our sins, but his mission was also to live a life of perfection. Jesus is the only person who ever lived a completely perfect life, completely righteous life without sin. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, what happened? An exchange took place. Now, what is the nature of that exchange? And we're going to get to 2 Corinthians 5 in a second. What was the nature of that exchange? Well, all of our sin was imputed to Jesus. All of our sin was attributed to Jesus, assigned to Jesus, accredited to Jesus as though it were his own sin. That is what Paul means in 2 Corinthians 5:21 when he says, for he made him who knew no sin be sin for us. That is how Jesus paid our debt to God. Jesus had no sin in himself, but our sin is imputed. It's accredited to him, and he suffered on that cross to pay the just penalty that our sin deserved. But notice it doesn't stop there in 2 Corinthians 5, does it? There's a second part. There's a second part of an exchange. All of our sin was placed on Christ as though it was his own, but the second part, it says in verse 21, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Our sin was imputed and accredited to Jesus, and Jesus' righteousness, his complete and utter perfection and perfect life without sin, that standing was accredited or imputed or given to us as we put our trust in him. You see, salvation, it's more than just a not guilty verdict from God. That's only half of it. Yes, our sins are forgiven. Why? Because our sin was placed upon Christ as though it were his own, and he bore the wrath in our place. There, done. But that's only half of it. Not only is all of our sin cleared from our account, but as believers, we are accredited with Jesus' good actions, with Jesus' goodness on our part. And that's a remarkable thing to think about. There's not the greater news that you ever hear. It's the greatest news that you'll hear both today and for the rest of your life. The fact that Jesus' perfect life, Jesus' perfect standing before God the Father has been attributed to you as though it were your own. By having the righteousness of Jesus attributed or imputed to us, God looks upon us as believers as completely perfect. Completely perfect. It's not our perfection, it's Jesus' perfection. But because we as believers are identified with him, God, when he looks at the believer, he sees the perfection of Jesus. That is the standing that we have before him. He looks at us and he sees holiness. He looks at us and he sees righteousness in terms of our standing and our position before him. In simple terms, this is what we refer to as the imputed righteousness of Jesus. He took our sin as though it were his own, and we took his righteousness. We were given his righteousness as though it were our own. And so let's ask the question then. In what way does the imputed righteousness of Jesus how does this act as a breastplate of armor within the spiritual battle? So we're not just talking about the theology of the imputed righteousness of Christ, but what are we meant to do with that? What are we meant to do with that in terms of our spiritual battle? When Paul says, put on the breastplate of righteousness, and if it's not our own righteousness, if it's Christ's righteousness, well, what are we meant to do with that? What are we meant to do with the imputed righteousness of Jesus acting as a breastplate of armor within the spiritual battle? Well, it's quite simple. When Satan puts those thoughts of condemnation into your mind, when he places those thoughts of discouragement into your thoughts, when Satan tells you that you are not good enough, when the devil points back at your track record as to how many times that you've failed, even as a Christian, and seeks to highlight that in your thinking, you know what the first thing you've got to do? The first thing you've got to do with that thought is that you've got to agree with it. Yes, that's right. That's me. You know what, Satan? I know I'm not good enough. You know what, Satan? I know that going by my track record alone, going by my own righteousness, I should be condemned, and this should be a cause of discouragement for me. I should shrink back into my little shell. I should stop serving the Lord or trying to do anything effective for the Lord. I should believe that thought. But that's only the half of it. Whatever we do, don't stop at that point. Don't shrink back into your little shell. Because yes, we agree in part with the devil, yes. Our track record condemns us. But the other half, we bring Jesus into our thinking. And what a difference that makes. Yes, my own track record, my own righteousness condemns me. I know I'm not good enough, but guess what, devil? I'm continuing on boldly in my Christian walk, and it's not based upon my own righteousness. It's based upon the righteousness of Jesus. I'm not continuing boldly on the basis of who I am, but I'm continuing on the basis of who Jesus is. And so yes, Satan, I agree with you. I have messed up in the past thoroughly, spectacularly. And guess what, devil? I'm going to continue to do so. But because I'm identified with my Savior, Jesus Christ, I know regardless of however I muck up, as long as my trust is in the right place, my Father in heaven looks upon me as perfect. And because God has accepted me on the basis of who Jesus is, because my acceptance before God is because of who Jesus is, then there is no basis whatsoever for me to be paralyzed with the scheming thoughts that the enemy would seek to place into my mind. There is no basis whatsoever. Guess what, Satan? This little turtle's coming out. He's coming out. In fact, this little turtle has so much confidence and security in Jesus. Well, guess what? I'm going to ditch that little shell altogether. After all, why do I need the shell if the righteousness of Jesus is my security? Friends, this is the breastplate of righteousness. This is what it means to counteract the schemes and the wicked wiles of the devil that would seek to invade your thoughts, that will attack you in the place, the seat of the emotions, condemning you, discouraging you. Well, what do you put on? You put on the breastplate of righteousness. We remind ourselves that, yes, you're right, devil. I should be discouraged. I should feel condemned. But then you remind yourself of the truth of God's word. You remind yourself of the imputed righteousness of Jesus. And you remember that God accepts us not because of how good we are, but because of how good Jesus is. And when we do, my friends, it's then we overcome and we have victory over the schemes of Satan. Well, next week we're going to continue in this series, finishing off the series of Know Your Enemy. We're going to do so by continuing through Ephesians chapter 6, looking at the other 5 pieces of the armor that we have here. But in the meantime, what are we going to do? Well, let's come before God and we're going to close with a word of prayer. We're just going to ask God's help for this. I realize that for some of us, we talk about the truth and girding ourselves with truth. I know we talk about the breastplate of righteousness, and I realize that perhaps many of us, in one way or another, have been pulling off track because unknowingly we have given into his schemes. Friends, we need to armor up. We're not putting on the physical armor, but we need to replace the lies of Satan with the truth of God's word. And as we do, and when we do, we will have victory. So let's just pray. Father, we pray today that you would help us. We ask that our minds would be sober, that they wouldn't be distracted from what is taking place in the spiritual realm, to the neglect of being mindful of what's happening in the spiritual world. Lord, help our minds to be vigilant, awakened, watchful of the reality of the spiritual realm in which Satan would seek to scheme against us. And Lord, I ask that you'd help us to be really good and become even better at filtering our thoughts, not accepting every single thought that pops into our mind as though it is true without first assessing it according to your word. Father, please help us to resist the schemes of Satan. Please help us to do so by applying the armor of God, applying spiritual truth to our lives. Lord, please help us to gird ourselves with truth, in the sense that we turn to your word for counsel, for direction, for there not to be a detachment in our lives when it comes to what we know and how it is that we live. Help us to put on, Lord, the breastplate of righteousness, that as our enemy tells us that we're not good enough, as he tries to condemn us, as he tries to discourage us by pointing out our failures, pointing out our inadequacies, help us, Lord, not to shrink back. Help us not to be paralyzed with discouragement, but help us to remember the imputed righteousness of Jesus that has been given to us, that has been accredited to us. Lord, help us to remember that we can continue serving you wholeheartedly, not on the basis of who we are, but on the basis of who Jesus is. Lord, thank you for hearing our prayers. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.